Thank you for joining us for Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Please send in your questions and join us each week as we explore the stories of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week for Ask a Historian is our very own Justine Lynn, who has been doggedly undertaking Black history research into early settlers in our community, or trying to, in the very least. And some of the challenges that have presented itself in the course of this research, we're going to explore with Justine here today. So thank you, Justine, for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. I'm excited to chit chat today.
So let's jump in, because I conducting early Black research in historic Mississauga is not a new program at Heritage Mississauga. We've had some fantastic finds over the years, but it's also presented its challenges, and those challenges aren't new ones, although some of the research that you've undertaken in the last little bit has focused on some new families that have come to light through the census records. But those challenges remain, and in terms of how do we find out about people? How do we have names, but how do you kind of piece together their story and learn more about them? And just wondering if you can touch on some of the interesting finds in terms of names on census records and people, but the challenges therein. And I wonder, maybe we'll just start with one of the families, and we can talk about these individuals as we go, and the opportunities and challenges that you found with each of them. But the first one would be the Lywick family, which we erroneously called the Lynch family for a period of time. Just wondering if you can kind of, who were they? What do we know? And where have you been stymied?
Yeah, so they show up in 1851, and Matthew, you've done a lot of research to kind of pinpoint where we likely think that they could have lived, which we're thinking is along modern day South Down Road in Clarkson. And so it's John and Sophia Lynch, and they're 30 and 31 years old respectively, and they're both actually born in England, and they belong to the Church of England, and they also have a son named Thomas, who at this point in 1851 is 6 years old. And so, as Matthew said, we were talking about them as the Lynch family. It's Sophia Lynch, it's John Lynch, and we were just kind of running with this. And I couldn't really find anything on, well, the main thing that I always go to is Ancestry, is kind of always my first thing that I go to. And I'm looking, it's like nothing, you can't find anything. And so then I'm looking at the census record and I'm saying, wait a second, this is not Lynch at all. I don't know what this is, because they're writing, in script handwriting. And so sometimes it's hard to decipher. Also too, and this wasn't really the case with this particular one, but also too, sometimes, they're scanned and the exposure is not that great. And so sometimes it's just hard to read census records, and so that was the case with this particular family. And so we reached out, well, actually you, Matthew, reached out to staff from PAMA, and we talked to staff here at Heritage Mississauga, and the consensus was that it's actually Lywick, Lywick, which is a last name originating from England, so makes sense with all of that. So yeah, so sometimes it's just hard to actually read the family names, which poses an issue.
And the only thing that really, what drew us to them in the first place was that little check mark in the ethnicity column saying that they were Black. Mm-hmm. Then, okay, so we have an early Black family here that, at least from the census records, have connections to England, although we know that what's recorded in the census records isn't always correct, and not that that's the case that we know for this family, but we've come across others which we'll talk about. But how do we find out more about them? And we have names, but in this case we haven't been able to trace very much more.
Yes, exactly. So this also, I'm glad that you brought this little check mark up, because in the 1851 census, like you're saying, it's basically just a tick, a check, whereas in other censuses, it's kind of formatted a little bit differently, and sometimes they would actually write it out. They would write like African out, things like that, so it's easier to read sometimes, and harder to make mistakes, I should say. So another family that I wanted to bring up, which is on the same census and listed as a neighbor of the Liwick family, is the Bush family. And so they also have this little tick. And so so they're identified as Black, and it's William and Margaret Bush. They both are born in Canada, and William is a shoemaker. And they're a young couple, 18, 19 years old. They don't have any children. That's probably because they're a young couple, probably very recently married, I'm assuming. And I was looking into this further. Once again, Ancestry, one thing about a lot of these sites is that people will be on it and they will have their own family trees, right? And so sometimes you're also looking at not just at the census records, but also at things like that. And I found a William and Margaret Bush, that were in Toronto Township, Mississauga at this time. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's them, right? I've cracked the case. And then as I'm looking through, I'm like, oh, these people are definitely white. And so, and it was odd, right? But they list Margaret Bush, her maiden name being Granger. Now, right underneath Margaret on the census record is actually Joseph Granger. So that kind of led me to think, oh, this could be the same people, right? Like, because it would in a way make sense that they might be next to family, right? Yep. So and William's father is listed as Russell Bush, who was kind of founding of the Bush Inn in Clarkson, I believe. Yep. So and so they had interest in the United States. I believe Russell was born in the United States and then moved over to Canada and then subsequently moved back to the United States. But there's things that are written about them and whatnot, but they don't appear to be African American. And that's fine, but it kind of raises the question, what was the census record all about then? So, and it's kind of a mystery, right? Was it wrong? Was there some error in it? We're not 100% sure, but there's a lot of these kind of questions. And so it's very difficult to look at early Black history a lot of times. Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things, when you look at these early families, and we know that we have the Liwicks and the Bushes, and then subsequently the Thomases, which we'll talk about later on the census record, and there's a tick that denotes ethnicity, and then the census taker sums up the number at the end, and we're finding that perhaps that is not always an accurate depiction of people. And so it raises some questions about our census record. So how does that present some of the challenges, kind of another layer of challenges, if you will, in the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so, you always have to take things, I think, with sometimes a bit of a grain of salt and be, having some critical thinking as well. But one thing that I did want to point out is that, in my opinion, I still think that the Canadian records of this era, in terms of Black history, are going to be better than the American records, only because prior to the Civil War, slaves were not considered people. Okay. And as callous as that is to say, that was the reality. And so they were not recorded. There's nothing on that's going to say, oh, William and Margaret Bush and so and this is where they lived. It's not going to have that. The best you're going to get is something like a slave schedule, which it basically lists oh, so-and-so slave owner had 5 slaves. And if you're lucky, they might say one of the slaves' name is John, but that's really it. So it's very vague. It's not too specific. So when you're trying to look at the origins of a lot of especially fugitive slaves or freedom seekers, it is very difficult to find anything about them. And especially if they ran away, you might find something like an advertisement put out by the slave owner saying, I'll give you this amount of money for the return of my slave Mary, right? And it might give a description, a short description. But ultimately, how many Marys are there in the entirety of Maryland or Georgia, or all these different places? Like a lot, right? And so it becomes very difficult. And it's just, and when you're trying to research these people, you kind of need an anchor in a way. Like I need to be able to say, okay, it's not just the first name, it's the last name, it's the age, it's the description, it's this, it's this, that all match, so that I can kind of say, yes, I believe that this is definitively that person. It kind of takes more than just a first name, right. Sometimes. So that is very challenging. And then of course, as well, if they are runaways, they probably don't have manumission papers. They probably didn't get their freedom. So it's really the 1870 census after the Civil War that is the first time that they are actually documented, right. As they were, quite a bit earlier in Canada, right? So that is too late for a lot of the fugitive slaves that were kind of most interested, because between 1850 and 1860 was the height of the Underground Railroad. Right. Because in 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically made it so that the slave catchers could more or less go into any state and capture the slave. Whereas prior to that, all you had to do is, get north into New York, Philadelphia, wherever not, and then you were more or less safe. But now you're no longer safe anywhere in the country. So they go north. They continue to go north into north of the border. So 1870 is going to be like a little bit too late, right, for what sometimes we're looking at. If you're talking about fugitive slaves, anyways. So that is challenging. But one thing that you do see come out of this era that is quite interesting is, there's a lot of like abolitionist movements in Canada, like the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada, and as well a very early newspaper, which was founded and edited by Henry Bibb, who was a fugitive slave that lived in Sandwich, which is now Windsor. Other newspapers might include the Provincial Freeman, things like this. And actually, one thing that is really interesting is that there was an agent of the Anti-Slavery Society who actually traveled through historic Mississauga, which is actually pretty interesting. What was his name? Yeah, his name was, Reverend Samuel Ringwald Ward. And he was very well known for his lecturing, for his speaking. And one thing that he was very adamant about was, lecturing for equality, especially, of course, anti-slavery, yes, but also even when you have your freedom, as we all know, there's still racism that happens in the world. And so a lot of, especially white abolitionists were kind of thinking, oh, well, we just need to fight this evil of slavery and now we're done. And he was kind of like, no, we're not done here. There's a lot more work to do. And so this is a really interesting, character. And these people wrote extensively, and there are things that, about their own lives and, and in newspapers. And Ward actually worked with the Provincial Freeman. So, these are all really, really good references to look at if you are doing research. I mean, it's not necessarily going to tell you, what is John and Sophia Lywick thinking,
Right.
but it's going to be able to tell you what was the sentiment, what were some things that were happening that contextually could help you understand, what life was like during that time.
And when Reverend Ward passed through here, he wrote a little bit about recollections of this place. I know it's not a treatise or an essay per se, but he did reflect a little bit on what he observed in historic Mississauga. Can you paraphrase a little bit of kind of
absolutely. Yeah, so he basically talks a lot about the farms, the farm fields, the soil. It's very well tilled. Very well tilled.
Good farms.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that because a lot of people back then, that was their dream, was to own a farm, to live off the land, things like this. So farms and agricultural talk is really big at this time. But then the one thing that he also says, and mind you, he visited many different places. Toronto Township is just one of the places that he went, and he's not really specific about where exactly he's talking about when he's talking about this, but he does say that when he visited all these different townships, anti-slavery finds enough work to do here, is what he says. Meaning that there is still racism that is prevalent, that is happening, and and that basically the fight is not over. We still need to continue. We still need to do things.
And I suppose when you first related that to me, which I thought was just an amazing find in your research, but my interpretation also was that meant that there were likely fugitive slaves here as well.
Yeah.
And we know that there were, but the fact that you've got somebody who is that well known in the anti-slavery society circles, who we know went through this place and observed life, what was happening in this place.
Yeah.
Quite remarkable. And then I'm also struck perhaps even more greatly by someone who in a way is in historic terms was hiding in our midst, and that was Reverend Alexander Orr. Is it Alexander Orr? Reverend Orr of Streetsville? Yeah. Who was, as a white Scottish-born minister, was highly involved in the anti-slavery society movement, and that I found.
So he was a director, and in the anti-slavery society report, he is listed as being there. He's listed as a director. He's listed as so he was definitely there. He was definitely in those circles. And it's interesting too, because he was known for his generosity, for his, goodwill towards others. One of these people that would give the shirt off of his back for someone, a stranger who he, didn't matter who you were, what your ethnicity was. He was like a good person, right? So this is a really interesting story and figure that is, right in our own backyard, basically. So and was involved as well with things that were happening outside of our borders as well, right?
And this is, something that I've kind of linked in my own brain and not necessarily put to paper yet, but we've recounted the last known visit of Solomon Northup to Streetsville taking place, and always one of those questions of, well, what brought him to Streetsville? As Solomon Northup, probably best known for 12 Years a Slave. But his last known place that he appeared in public was in Streetsville, and then you link back to somebody like Reverend Orr, and you're thinking, well, maybe that's the reason he came to Streetsville, that you had somebody who was that involved and motivated to support the anti-slavery society. Maybe that's the reason that someone like Solomon Northup ended up at a public engagement in Streetsville. And it just those links just keep kind of popping up, but it tells you research is ongoing, because a couple of years ago we hadn't linked to Reverend Orr, and yet he was right there in our stories. Quite a fun. So, like you painted a picture a little bit earlier on of kind of life and times, if you will. You talked about the Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Act. And, it kind of paints a picture not only about the freedom seekers and finding their way to Canada, but that fear that they must have lived under of the potential of being captured and trying to hide and trying to build a life for yourself. And it's just, that strikes me as something to keep in mind, that these are still people who have real fears for their safety. And we talked about the Liwicks, we talked about the Bushes, whether they were or were not. But another one of the families we've intersected with in our research has been the Spencer family, and they lived in the Cooksville area, near Dundas and here, Ontario, perhaps even on Agnes Street. We're not entirely sure. But they appear in the census records over 2 consecutive years and had a number of children. And again, I know we don't have a lot on them beyond names, but just maybe walk us through a little bit of kind of the research behind trying to find out more.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting family because I know that there's a story here.
Yes.
And it's not fully like out and discovered, but there's definitely a story. So in 1861, a family shows up on the census, and it's John Sr. and Jane Spencer, married couple, and they're both born in the United States, listed as African American, and they have with them at this point in time 4 children. Later there will be 5, but at this point 4. The oldest is John Jr., who's 8 years old. So that would put his birth around 1853, if my math is right. And he's born in Canada. So this is interesting, is that likely they came in or around that time, but probably I'm guessing anyways, probably after the 1851 census, because we don't see them there. Yeah. We only see them 1861. So, so basically they probably would have been, I'm guessing, like 1852 to 1853 having come to Canada. And John Jr. is very interesting as well, because, so like I said, he's 8 years old. And if you think of, people out there probably, have children around that same age, where are they? They're in school, right? John Jr. is not in school. He's actually working to support his family as a laborer. And so you kind of think to yourself that it would have been a very hard time for early Black settlers. Yeah, sure, you have your freedom, okay, that's great, but the struggles don't end there, right? It's hard work every single day, and you have to do things that to whatever you have to do to survive, right? And in 1871 they show up again, and this is also interesting because a lot of our early Black settlers, they come as a stopping point and then they move on. So, but this family stays a bit longer. So 1871, they're here. They have another child, William, but John Sr., the father, is no longer present, and we're not sure why. But in 1853, we have Jane Spencer, the mother, and she's basically, she's listed as living in Cooksville, and it's just her, right? Like, and normally they would have put the man as a head of the house, yeah, but it's her listed. So we're guessing that he's not, at this point, 3 years or 2 years later, he's still not in the picture. So we don't know what happened. And this is kind of what Matthew is talking about like, you can't really speculate sometimes. I mean, you could speculate, but it only shows you so much. It only shows you dates and and who was there, and who is residing there, and births and things like this. It doesn't tell you what was this person like, and what was the family issues that were happening, what were things that were happening in the family. We don't know.
We
Yeah.
don't know that he died. We don't know that he simply might be working somewhere else and,
Yeah, yeah,
wait for the family
we
to
don't know.
move.
I mean, she's not listed as a widow,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
perhaps he's still alive. We just don't know, to be honest with you. And this is kind of where the trail goes cold in Mississauga. Now fast forward to 1911. Sarah Louise Spencer, the second child of the family, we find her in the Coburg Insane Asylum. And when I found this, I was quite shocked, actually. And I learned that that particular asylum was overflow for 7 similar such institutions in the province. So basically, she more or less could have come from anywhere. Now, in 1921, she is in the Ontario Hospital, also an insane asylum in Toronto. I think that that's on Queen Street, if I'm not remembering correctly. And that was also another similar such institution where there was a lot of overcrowding, as I've said. Not a really great situation. Obviously, she's alone, she's single, she's illiterate, she's at this point elderly. It's not a great situation, let's just say that. And in 1929, she dies of a hemorrhage, but they also list a kind of a secondary cause of her being just very senile, is what they say. And she's 74 years old, buried at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. Now, one thing that I will say about the record that talks about where she's buried, because yes, you could just look at the line, but if you kind of zoom out and you look at everything, right? The people around her, they all have family, all listed, family, right? And for her, it's like blank. Like it's like there's no family to speak of. Yeah. And that's something that really got to me. Like that you find yourself mourning for someone that died 100 years ago type thing. Yeah. And it is quite sad. And on her death certificate, it says that she was administered into the London hospital in 1873. So the same year that her mother is listed as being in Cooksville. So what is she doing in London? Who knows? Who admitted her? Who knows? Why was she there? No one knows. And it's quite upsetting, to be honest with you. But yeah, and there's a lot of questions, and we don't know as of right now.
She unfortunately spent a great deal of her life in the asylum. And like I said, we don't know. There's another. That's one child of 5, so there's 4 other siblings.
Yeah.
You'd have to think at some point there would have been descendants from that, and so what's the story there, and what happened to John? We don't know. What happened to the son, John Jr.? We don't know, and so those are questions yet to be answered and yet to be kind of uncovered. But like you said, you feel in your heart that there's a bigger story here, and hopefully it's one we get to tell in time.
Yeah. So. Yeah, absolutely. And also just to remind everyone that, on these census records, like it is real people. They're on the census records, they're just names, right? And so it's sometimes easy to remove yourself from that and just kind of be doggedly pursuing these leads and this and that, and that's fine and good, but also I think it's important to have like real reverence for these things that happen, because they were real people's lives, and as we see with the Spencer family, sometimes there's not always a happy ending, right? So
true enough. You mentioned earlier some of the kind of historic newspapers, but they've been very interesting resources for you to consult with, I know, and particularly I believe it's Voice of the Fugitive. And can you tell us a little bit about people who either want to do their own research or maybe want to help us and contribute to things we're looking at? Just it's kind of what's out there and what you've consulted and.
Yeah, sure. So I really particularly like the Voice of the Fugitive. I just find it to be a really interesting read, because Henry Bibb, he talks, and he knew obviously what slavery was like firsthand, and he wrote an autobiography about his life, and talked at length about that, which I also encourage people to read. It's quite interesting, but he talks about like when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. That's really what spurred his newspaper to be formed. He was outraged by it, horrified by it, and so he, I believe it's one of the first issues, and he is just attacking it basically, like, but it's really, and rightfully so, but it's really interesting to actually, read like firsthand what someone who was a former slave thought about these things that were happening and how they were horrified, and we have the hindsight to kind of, I guess, sometimes, make light in a way sometimes of these things, but at the time, they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know, is it possible that slave catchers could come into Canada? Are we ever safe? And so I find it interesting that you do see a lot of people like going, they don't just come over the border and settle there. A lot of times, like, they continue to go north because they're terrified.
Right.
So I think like reading a lot of these things, it's really important in terms of understanding what people felt at that time. And of course, everyone, it's not just Bibb's personal opinions. Like, everyone has their own opinions. There's lots of people that wrote him letters and he would publish them, and things like that. So yeah, but I just think that those kinds of things are really interesting for context if you're wanting to know to research these things. And the other thing that I was also wanting to say, in terms of if people are wanting to also, help us, one thing is that a lot of, like, everyone, more or less everyone who we're talking to, or talking about rather, is, we don't have images of them or things like this. One of the only families that we do have images for is the Thomas family, which we have had the pleasure to connect with the Thomas family's descendants. So the Thomas family, they show up in 1851 census. John and Catherine Thomas, and their two children, George and May. The parents are born in the United States, and the children are listed as being born in Canada, and all are listed as African American. So this is a very interesting family, and I won't give away too much because we do have an interesting program coming up a bit about this, but connecting with descendants is something that is very important to us, and really gives them like a face, a character, a bit more than just a name on a census. And we love talking to the family members. That's really, really great. I mean that's one of the most pleasurable things about all of this has been connecting with these people. So that's what I would say about that.
Well, and we, like I said, we won't give too much away. We do have an exciting program coming in March that will explore this a little bit more. But we talked about kind of the understanding life and times, and that these are real people, and things that would have impacted them, like the Fugitive Slave Act in the United States and the formation of the Anti-Slavery Society here in Canada. These would have been felt as kind of central to their being of these moments in time. And we can confirm with the Thomases that Catherine was an emancipated former slave, and John, as John Dorsey, was a fugitive slave. And so these would have been impacts in their lives, these things that we've all talked about. And they were here on the ground in historic Mississauga. neighbors to the Lynch family and the Bush family in the 1851-52 census. And so we can confirm that. And like I said, stay tuned for more. We won't give away any more than that, but
Yeah.
we have uncovered more information. So maybe we'll end on that with the carrot saying more is coming, and stay tuned to Heritage Mississauga in the months ahead, and we look forward to kind of exploring this significant story with you in greater detail as it evolves. And with that, Justine, I want to say thank you so much for joining us here on Ask a Historian, and always being willing to chat history and kind of explore your findings. And I know it's a work in progress. So the next time we chat about this, we may even have more information. So we'll see as it goes. But
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So thank you, Justine, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you for spending some time with us here on Ask a Historian. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow us here at Heritage Mississauga and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings. And please send in your stories each and every week, and we will explore the history of the city of Mississauga here at Ask a Historian.